Hole in the Day declared that he would not allow anyone with European blood onto the White Earth Reservation. This was devastating news for the mixed bloods of Crow Wing, as it meant that they would be cut off from their tribal identity as well as government annuities and other benefits. For Beaulieu, a mixed blood of French and Indian descent, it spelled disaster.
Hole in the Day the Younger was perhaps one of the most influential American Indian political leaders of the mid-19th century. Could also be called one of the most influential political leaders in Minnesota's history.
You'd have to say he was a natural-born genius because he was so remarkably intelligent. And white officials constantly commented that they just couldn't believe that some young boy coming out of the woods of Minnesota could speak so logically and forcefully and articulate.
Certainly he was very human, apparently fairly selfish in some of his behavior. And yet much of it was for the good of his own people, too. I think for his time, he was probably a very good, strong leader.
I think he was truly a visionary, a man way ahead of his time.
Who was Chief Hole in the Day? This remarkable man is no longer a familiar figure in Minnesota history, yet for 20 years he had more impact on shaping the face of central Minnesota than any other Native American man of his time. The story of Chief Hole in the Day begins with his father, who was also known as Hole in the Day. Hole in the Day the Elder joined the Sandy Lake Band of Ojibwe, where he became friends with the band's war chief, Curlyhead. Curlyhead made Hole in the Day his pipe bearer, a position that gave Hole in the Day power and standing within the tribe. Before his death some years later, Curlyhead declared that Hole in the Day was to succeed him as ward chief. Because of his standing with the band and the attention he was given by Curlyhead, Hole in the Day was able to claim that he himself was a chief. By the time Hole in the Day attained chieftainship, he had several wives and a number of children. Although little is known about most of his children, one became Hole in the Day's heir apparent from early childhood. He was given his father's name, so to avoid confusion, his father gave him a nickname.
Hole in the Day the Elder gave the name to his son, the Ojibwe word for boy. And so he was called Boy all of the years he was growing up. And it said that even after he became the principal chief, those that were used to calling him Boy kept on calling him Boy, and he didn't seem to mind that. It was the name his father had given him.
Conflicts with the Dakota who frequented Crow Wing forced Hole in the Day the Elder to make a permanent camp near Little Falls in Morrison County. He proved to be an able leader, and he remained fierce and terrifying as a warrior. Although Hole in the Day often made peaceful gestures to the surrounding Dakota, his retribution when crossed was devastating, and he never hesitated to use his opportunities for revenge as a training ground for his son's education.
Hole in the Day the Elder was upset that several of his relatives had been killed by Wahpeton Dakotas from the Lac-Qui Parle area. And he decided, after many years of trying to keep peace, he decided that he was going to take his revenge this time. And so he met up with this Wahpeton party, and they even had a feast with Hole in the Day and a few of his followers, and Boy was with. But after the party drifted off to sleep, Hole in the Day said, okay, now's the time, we're going to massacre them. So they literally killed about a dozen people and literally chopped them up into bits. And the story goes that Hole in the Day had his son Boy, who was about 10 years old, had him personally kill a boy, or even, I think it was a boy, of his own age.
The lessons were harsh, but the boy learned them well. Hole in the Day the elder saw the changes between tribes brought about by pressure from whites moving into the area. He knew that his son would have to be bold and shrewd. He would have to walk between two worlds, between the ancient traditions of the Ojibwe people and the unfamiliar landscape of white culture. The boy quickly showed that he was an able student to his father's lessons.
Hole in the Day was very astute. I believe that his father had groomed him as the King of Britain would groom his son to succeed him. He was groomed for chieftainship.
The boy had barely reached manhood when his father's leadership passed to him. An accident killed the elder Hole in the Day as he traveled home from St. Anthony Falls, where he had been negotiating the sale of some land.
So he went down to talk to the chiefs at Prairie du Chien in May of 1847. And then on the return upriver, he got drunk, the story goes, at St. Anthony Falls, and he's with some traders. And then they took him, I guess, kind of in his drunken state on a Red River ox cart, and he was carried up towards the Little Falls area. And at some point, he fell out of the ox cart, and one of the wheels apparently went over him and kind of crushed him.
The boy became chief, the leader of a small band of people living in a remote, hostile area of central Minnesota. Despite the great weight of his loss, the new chief Hole in the Day had little time to mourn. His destiny awaited him, and he rose to meet it. Hole in the Day lost no time in asserting his power as chief. Within a few months of his father's death, he was negotiating with the white government with as much diplomacy and wisdom as his father had.
In 1847, after his father died, he went to a council regarding the selling of this land that his father was going to sell for the Winnebago tribe to have a reservation. He went there, he declared that he was the head chief in place of his father, and he even told the white officials that they couldn't deal with these other people, that they had to deal with him because it was his land and he was the head chief, and he made the treaty personally with the government. And because of his boldness and mystique, I guess you could say, he got away with it.
Hole in the Day's audacity irritated the chiefs of the other area bands. Hole in the Day declared to the white government that he was the head chief over all the tribes, an office that did not even exist among the autonomous bands. Many of the leading chiefs only respected hereditary chieftainship, and they saw Hole in the Day as a pretender to power that was not rightfully his. However, Hole in the Day was a born diplomat, and his ability to negotiate with the white government made him invaluable.
Most of the bands around Crow Wing and Gull Lake and Mille Lacs, and maybe even some of the pillager bands at Leech Lake, they more or less decided to allow him to be their main representative with the government. Whether they really accepted him as like a head chief controlling them in any way, I don't think they really had that feeling.
European mindset during this era of settlement was that good Indians were those who would leave their native ways behind and embrace a European lifestyle. Hole in the Day understood that if his tribe did not learn the white man's way of life, they could not survive. Although there is no evidence that he was fluent in English, he had an interpreter read the newspapers to him daily. He seemed to envision a future that included the best of both white and Ojibwe cultures.
He was really respected by white people in the beginning of his chieftainship. Even though he was so young, they really respected the fact that he was allowing missionaries to come up, and eventually he started his own farm and had a house, and he wore a white man's clothes, and it seemed like he was becoming very acculturated. And he even was proud of that. And he told his fellow people, you know, look at me, I'm getting rich because I have these crops, and I can sell my extra crops to the whites, and I can earn more money that way. It's better to do this than to be going off into the woods on an uncertain hunt.
Hole in the Day made several trips to Washington to negotiate treaties and to make sure that those treaties were upheld. He had little patience when the government failed to keep up any part of its bargain.
Hole in the Day the Younger did pick up a lot of knowledge by what means were not really too clear, but he seemed to have a lot of knowledge about the white people. And he argued in 1855 that he wanted his tribe to become American citizens, and that he wanted his tribe to be subject to American law. And I believe he did this because he wanted his people to be treated equally the same way that the American citizens were treated.
Within the tribe, many of the Ojibwe deeply resented Hole in the Day's power over the bands and his influence with the government. He was given large amounts of money and tracts of land by the government as a reward for signing treaties affecting bands all across central Minnesota. While many were angry that Hole in the Day was becoming rich at the expense of other Indians, none could dispute that he was fiercely protective over the bands when he felt that the government was cheating them.
One basic fact about Hole in the Day is this matter of wanting justice. When he made a treaty, he expected that the government would live up to the terms of the treaty. And when the government failed to do it in any kind of way, Hole in the Day would take issue, and not just in a light way. He would be forceful about it. He would make demonstrations to bring attention to his grievances.
So the guy had was tremendous leadership qualities. He was arrogant, that's part of his style, but he got results.
He was a man, I think, who had feet firmly planted in two diametrically opposed cultures and did it successfully. But because he was trying to operate in two cultures, he was controversial. Visionary people often are. He was so controversial that it led to his death.
In 1861, a new agent was appointed for the Mississippi Ojibwe bands, and his name was Lucius Walker. And these agents were selected mainly because they were going to play this embezzling game. They were going to embezzle money, and they were probably going to share it with their colleagues and people that got them into the positions of agent.
Perhaps Walker did not expect annuity payments to be monitored by the people of Crow Wing, but when a payment was distributed in December of 1861, Clement Beaulieu, a prominent resident of Crow Wing and a trader at the village, became suspicious that money was being stolen. He decided to begin an investigation of his own, and finding abundant proof of fraud, he made a trip to Washington.
A trip to Washington. When he got to Washington, he addressed the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, Commissioner Dole, and was told that indeed they would look into that. He pointed out to Dole that they had gone through the books, they had made a count, and an example is that there was one particular camp, a band, that they knew had 70 individuals. Well, Lucius Walker had marked that as 120 individuals. They were receiving about $10 a person, so with that small population, he then was able to pocket $500. Well, as this got extrapolated, Clement Beaulieu and Hole in the Day estimated that Lucius Walker had pocketed more than $8,000 of money that was supposed to be sent to the Ojibwe people of the Crow Wing community.
Beaulieu returned to Crow Wing to await justice. Instead, he received word that Walker, who had learned of his trip to Washington, reacted by revoking Beaulieu's trader's license. Now Beaulieu would not even be able to collect the money rightfully owed to him from his trade at Crow Wing. Shocked at the sudden turn of events, Beaulieu turned to Hole in the Day for help. In June of 1862, Hole in the Day decided he must make his own trip to Washington on behalf of Beaulieu.
Now, the commissioner, William Dole, apparently said at first that he would look into the matter and have it investigated to the chief's satisfaction. So the chief went home and was apparently happy that something was going to be done about the matter. However, as the weeks went by that summer, nothing was done. He heard no word. And in fact, he began to hear that this same commissioner was coming to Minnesota to treat with the Red Lake Ojibwe bands and have a treaty with them. And by that time, Hole in the Day was furious.
Determined to force Dole to pay attention to his grievances, Hole in the Day sent some of his young men to kill cattle owned by the Chippewa Agency and started rumors that the Indians would attack Fort Ripley. His threats could hardly have come at a worse time for whites living in the area. The Civil War was raging, and thousands of Minnesota's most able soldiers were fighting in the Deep South. There was very little to stop Hole in the Day from carrying out his attacks.
This was 1862. There was war raging all around. People were very fearful of Hole in the Day's leadership. They were very fearful of the way he wielded military power.
On August 18th, the same morning Hole in the Day had the agency cattle killed, the Dakota chief Little Crow began an uprising of his own. In the southern Minnesota area of New Ulm, whole families were slaughtered as hundreds of whites fell victim to Dakota wrath. News of the uprising at New Ulm reached Walker at Crow Wing about the same time he heard the rumors that the Indians were threatening his life, and he panicked. Terrified of Hole in the Day's retribution, he fled, stopping at Fort Ripley to send soldiers back to Crow Wing to arrest the chief.
The soldiers came into Crow Wing and happened to sight Hole in the Day, and they followed him as Hole in the Day ran back towards his house, which was about 2 miles north of Crow Wing. And Hole in the Day also had a ferry across the Mississippi at his house. So when he got to his home, he quickly got his family and they hopped on their ferry and got across the Mississippi just as about 20 soldiers rode up. And apparently they fired. They don't know who fired the first shot exactly, but the soldiers did fire, and I believe Hole in the Day was slightly wounded. But otherwise, he made good his escape.
Hole in the Day sent messengers to the pillagers, then to all of the Ojibwe bands as far away as Lake Superior to gather at Gull Lake for war. He claimed to have killed all the white people in the Crow Wing area and instructed the other bands to do the same before they came to Gull Lake. The Ojibwe, who had always been friendly with the whites, refused to kill them based on Hole in the Day's word, but they did take some goods from the whites while some unknown Indians burned the missions at St. Columba and Lower Mission Lake. The bands traveled to Gull Lake with the captives and met up with more than 200 other Ojibwe who had responded to the call. Once there, they found out that Hole in the Day had lied about killing whites in Crow Wing, and they became angry with his attempts to get them in the middle of what they saw as his problem. They did remain, however, uncertain about how the whites might react to the Indians' perceived show of aggression. Whether they wanted to be or not, they were now part of Hole in the Day's uprising. George Sweet, a man of good reputation among the Indians, and the wronged trader Clem Beaulieu, spoke with Captain Francis Hall, commander at Fort Ripley, and agreed with him that Commissioner Dole should be brought to Crow Wing to help resolve the conflict. Sweet and Beaulieu traveled quickly to Gull Lake and spoke with Hole in the Day, asking him to wait for 4 days until Dole, who was at St. Cloud, could come to meet with him at the fort. Hole in the Day refused to go to the fort, knowing that doing so would make him too vulnerable. Instead, he agreed to meet at Crow Wing at Clem Beaulieu's home. Sweet and Beaulieu encouraged Hole in the Day to settle matters quickly, especially since word had reached them that Walker had been found dead near Monticello, apparently of a suicide. The chief agreed to release the white captives that he had as a show of good faith. Dole tried frantically to raise soldiers to accompany him to Crow Wing, and was finally able to muster about 100 armed men. He arrived at the Beaulieu house in Crow Wing on September 10th and watched as Hole in the Day crossed the river alone and made his way toward the house. Along the way, however, warriors slipped out of the woods and began to join the chief, so that by the time he arrived at the Beaulieu house, he also had about 100 warriors. To Dole's dismay, Another 100 armed Indians appeared on the road behind him, blocking off his retreat. More streamed in from the woods, outnumbering the whites 3-1. Dole spoke first, alternately threatening the Indians with destruction and making offers for a peaceful resolution. Finally, when it became obvious to Hole in the Day that Dole would do nothing to settle matters to his satisfaction, he stood and graciously shook hands with the leading whites in the group. Then he turned to Dole and said, "Are you the smartest man that our great father could send at a trying time like this? Because if you are the smartest man that our great father has got, I pity our great father."
So the Hole in the Day left the council and said he'd come back the next day, but then he didn't show up. Eventually, Dole had to wait for a while, and he got tired of waiting. So he left, and he appointed Ashley Morrill to handle matters. I guess he was the Crow Wing postmaster. So Morrill tried to talk to Hole in the Day and the Pillager chiefs, and eventually the Pillager chiefs decided that they didn't want to have anything to do with any kind of war here. So they surrendered to Morrill. And Hole in the Day had no choice but to back down at that point. He felt like he had not enough support among the Ojibways to continue to threaten a resistance.
Although the threat had passed, the Minnesota government sent a group to Crow Wing to meet with Hole in the Day. Though state governments cannot legally enter into treaties, the group wrote a treaty agreeing to investigate the fraud by Walker, to make good the defaulted annuities, and, on learning that whites had burned Hole in the Day's home at Crow Wing, agreed to pay him for a new home. Considering Hole in the Day's inability to follow through with any threats, he considered the treaty a great victory. Once again, he had been able to use his intelligence, his understanding of white government, and his audacity to get what he wanted. However, the uprising came with heavy costs. Time passed, and Crow Wing grew from a small trading post to a bustling village. White settlers swarmed into the area, drawn by the timber trade and cheap farmland. A Chippewa agency was set up at Crow Wing, designed to keep peace between whites and natives and to oversee the distribution of government goods and annuity payments to the tribal members. The cash payments were not closely monitored by the government, making the money a target for corrupt officials. Ironically, the uprising that was meant to bring about more justice for the Ojibwe people sealed their fate. The white settlers could not forget the fear of the threatened uprising. They began to appeal to the government for a more permanent solution.
There was more and more talk of removal of the Ojibwe from that region, and actually from a lot of parts of Minnesota. A number of treaties were made in the 1860s whereby they were going to remove the Mississippi Ojibwe bands. They settled on the tract of land known as White Earth. So in 1867, Hole in the Day made that treaty in Washington, which established the White Earth Reservation.
The long-standing resentment that other band members felt toward Hole in the Day intensified. Most chiefs knew that Hole in the Day had irrevocably damaged their relationship with the whites, and even his closest friends began to avoid him. One of them, Clem Beaulieu, tried to remain neutral, but then an event occurred that made staying neutral impossible.
It turns out that Hole in the Day had gone into the saloon, one of the saloons at one time, and somehow got into a fist fight with somebody. And when he came out of the saloon, he had black and blue marks on his face. And he told somebody that his relatives, the mixed bloods, had done this to him, and that he was going to have revenge.
Hole in the Day declared that he would not allow anyone with European blood onto the White Earth Reservation. This was devastating news for the mixed bloods of Crow Wing, as it meant that they would be cut off from their tribal identity as well as government annuities and other benefits. For Beaulieu, a mixed blood of French and Indian descent, it spelled disaster.
Now this would have been a great threat to Clem Beaulieu in particular. He had been impoverished by the fact that Walker and his Confederates had stolen so much money in 1862, and had fired him as a licensed trader on the reservation. So Bulio was kind of a poor man at this point.
Bulio knew that Hole in the Day had the power to keep him off the White Earth Reservation. He sought out other mixed bloods, men like Peter Roy, John George Morrison, George Fairbanks, and Charles Ruffy, to help him devise a plan to eliminate Hole in the Day and his threat to them. All of these men had been Hole in the Day's closest friends. Now they formed a plan to murder him. As the date for the removal drew near, Hole in the Day was frustrated by the fact that the improvements to the White Earth Reservation the government had promised had not yet been carried out. He wanted to block the removal entirely until the government fulfilled their promises made in the treaty. In the summer of 1868, he made plans to travel to Washington one more time to make his demands known.
Clem Bulio and his Confederates had learned of this proposed trip, and they apparently secured some people from Leech Lake who agreed to kill Hole in the Day.
On a warm June day, Hole in the Day traveled to Crow Wing and finalized his plans. He would leave for the next day for Washington. He made several stops in the village, then began his trip back to his home on Gull Lake. He could not have known that along the way, assassins hid in the tall grass in an area known simply as Big Field.
And it's known who killed him. There were some young Indians from Leech Lake. The number is still in doubt. Some said 9, some said 11, other figures came out. He was traveling by horse and buggy with his bodyguard, a guy named Ojibwa, and neither the bodyguard nor Hole in the Day had a gun, had a rifle.
It's like he immediately knew that this was the end. And he said to them, "You've caught me at a bad time because I don't have my pistol with me." And with that, one of the Indians fired his shotgun and shot Hole in the Day.
Hole in the Day fell from the buggy, fatally wounded. The assassins repeatedly shot and stabbed him. When they were sure he was dead, they stripped his body, taking everything of value, drug him to the side of the road, and left. Hole in the Day was buried near the Catholic cemetery at Crow Wing. It is said that after the chief's assassination, mixed bloods flooded into the White Earth Reservation. There was an investigation into Hole in the Day's death, but charges were never brought against the young pillagers who committed the murder. For years it was believed that jealousy motivated the crime, but an inquest into the assassination held at White Earth beginning in 1912 revealed that the pillagers who killed Hole in the Day had been promised $1,000 in a house if they would carry out the assassination. The promises, they said, came mainly from Clem Bulio, and they were never fulfilled. Hole in the Day's legacy lives on in the form of a wildlife preserve at Hole in the Day Lake north of Brainerd. Little else remains as a tribute to this remarkable warrior and statesman.